Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on how to achieve net zero, an introduction to Scope 3. I'm just going to wait for a further 30 seconds to a minute for everyone to join in, and then we'll kick off this webinar. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a session with Reid Cunningham, myself, Sunil Shah. We're going to talk about net zero, and in particular talking around Scope 3 emissions. It's an introduction, so we'll go into a bit more detail about what the terminology is and the subject area itself. And thank you very much to IWFM for hosting this webinar and a series of webinars that we've been doing on raising the profile of Scope 3 emissions. So let's say the review today will look at an overview of the Scope 3 emissions and some research which is being undertaken to capture some data and knowledge around what the emissions are, but also the impacts of the FM sector on the wider built environment activities. And then to take a bit of a deep dive into the experiences from BAM FM and what BAM have learnt over the past few years in terms of looking at greenhouse gas emissions, improvements in data quality, but also how they've used that data as well. And then we've got a good chunk of time at the end, about 20 minutes, to run through Q&A. So if you have any questions, please do post them. And we'll run through those questions towards the end, and then a quick wrap up at the end. So the speakers themselves, my name's Sunil Shah. I'm the Managing Director of Eclair Advisory, and I'll be joined today by Reid Cunningham, the Strategic Development Director at BAM FM and BAM Energy, and we'll provide a bit more detailed introductions later. And the most important number, the CPD number for this event, is 6000986. So we can pop that into the chat function as well. So that's the number to record this session as well on your CPD list. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just run into who we are and a bit of background into the project as well. So the Eclair Advisory runs a program called the SFMI, and the SFMI is all around how do we drive ESG leadership within the FM industry. So a lot of what we're trying to do is around providing a framework and a structure to allow organisations to understand where they are, but also the stepping stones and what they need to do to be able to improve. So we've been around for 10 years, providing the SFMI in terms of a benchmarking activity, and that's more recently broadened out, working with partners, but also working with industry groups such as RICS, IWFM and IEMA to provide some of that forward roadmap exercise aligned with some of the new regulations that are coming out and some of the new reporting requirements as well. The range of organisations that are involved listed up here, and again the role that we have is very much about how do we understand what good practice looks like, but it's also very much about sharing that experience and sharing where we are within our peer groups and about working collaboratively together. And that again extends out to the professional institutes that we also work with as well, and that connection out towards other sectors also. So the piece of work that we've been involved in, and BAM and Reid were the early adopters for this. They funded and supported us for the first programme of activities. And it's very much looking at the role that FM has and how it plays into the whole building life cycle carbon emissions. So we hear a lot about some of the embodied carbon activities. We hear a lot about the capture of the electricity and the gas during the use of a building. But what isn't often mentioned and covered is the role that FM has in terms of the services which are provided to manage and maintain the building itself. And that's both in terms of the provision and the delivery of those services, catering services, cleaning, M&E, and so on. But it's also the capability that FM has to be able to enhance the building and to be able to provide more than just the standardized services. So there is an ability to be able to extend the life of assets, to be able to reduce emissions that takes place, to bring health and well-being benefits as well to those that work within the building also. And it's about how do we capture and understand where that can also be implemented and the life cycle carbon impacts as well. So the end output of what we're looking to do is to develop a standard which will be globally recognized. We've already got the existing framework that's going to be included as part of the RICS whole life carbon building model. And then it's about having that as a global tool to be able to measure FM emissions in a standardized way. The other key parts of it is then about how do we provide specific data, so we're able to talk about the role that FM has plays and achievement of decarbonisation of buildings through the choice and the way that we deploy those FM services. So the 4-stage approach is currently in stage 2, and at this part here we're talking about developing a standardised framework and a tool to allow us to have systematic measurements of FM emissions and GHG footprints. The next stage on from that will then look to develop the data set that we have, go out and start to collect significant amounts of data in terms of contract level emissions. And then it's to have that globally recognized decarbonisation pathway for the FM sector. So that's then looking at how do we achieve the net zero and working in partnership with those others within the building sector, but also with organisations as well. And we've been partnered some great organisations here as well. So the likes of Optima, Skanska and Bouygues and BAM as well have been involved in terms of trialling out the framework. And then it's also been working with IEMA, IWFM and RICS to extend out to their membership groups as well. So if we start to talk about net zero, what do we mean by net zero? So at its very simplest level, net zero is the balance between the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced and the amount that's going to be removed from the atmosphere. So it's a balance that exists between the two. There's 2 key factors that are involved. One part is that it is about reducing emissions from existing sources. So to get to net zero, it must include an ability to be able to reduce those emissions from the day-to-day activities taking place. And secondly, it's about removing those greenhouse gases from the atmosphere as well. And so the key terminology that we have around this is 2 key parts. One is about carbon neutrality. So that's where an organisation uses offsets to be able to remove or avoid emissions, and that can happen at any point in time. And so that's during the journey of reducing those emissions, offsetting, and through valid long-term removals can then achieve carbon neutrality. There is some very great specificity around the net zero side of things. I shouldn't say that word. And that is around how we define that achievement of net zero through the long-term science-based target. And that is about achieving and reducing emissions through a significant amount. For the FM sector and for the building sector, that is in excess of 85%. So from your baseline to have reduced by more than 85% your total emissions, including your Scope 3 emissions. And then what's left is residual emissions, which cannot be removed by any other means or by other activities. Those can then be neutralized by permanent carbon removal. So that doesn't include things like forestry activities and so on, because those aren't deemed to be permanent. So the achievement of net zero is both in terms of time, in that your Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions takes time to be able to reduce by that significant amount. And the second part of it is our definition in terms of what we mean by permanent carbon removal. And at the minute, there's relatively few sources that we have available to achieve that permanent reduction. So I've mentioned about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So this is a short diagram around what we mean by each of those three. So Scope 1 is the direct emissions from fuel used within an organisation. So that will be things like gas, petrol and diesel. It will also include leakages that takes place from your refrigerant gas activities as well. And it will also include your fleet vehicles and any other vehicles which are owned by the organisation. So all of that will come within your Scope 1 data sets. Your Scope 2 data set is your indirect emissions from purchasing of energy. So that is, for most organisations, is the purchasing of that electricity. It can also include any district energy which you may be purchasing. So the purchasing of district heat will also be captured and covered within here. And then your Scope 3 is everything else that you're involved in your business. And that's separated out into two parts. One is your upstream activities. So that's everything that takes place to enable your business to operate and to work. And then your downstream activities is everything that you've produced and what happens to that. So for a lot of FM companies, which are a service-based organisation set, we don't produce products as such directly, and therefore the service element is largely within the upstream activities. Where you do provide a product itself, those would normally get captured within your downstream activities, and then it's about how do you manage those products through their life as well. And that also includes how your customers will use those emissions, and that gets included as well. So your Scope 3 includes a significant amount of impact and activity for an organisation. And as we're moving through and starting to reduce the amount of buildings and people start working more from home, we start to reduce the amounts of fleets, and individuals will start to use their own vehicles as well. We're reducing our Scope 1 and 2, but we're also increasing our Scope 3. So those emissions haven't disappeared. They have moved from your Scopes 1 and 2 and into your Scope 3. And that's the other reason why it's so important to be capturing all your Scopes 1, 2, and 3. Otherwise, we can get into quite a dangerous game or just playing around with Scope 1 and 2, shifting a lot of that into Scope 3, and then not reporting on that kind of data. So you are reducing your emissions, but actually as a whole organisation, there may not be as big a reduction as would otherwise be perceived. So what do we mean by net zero, and what sorts of things should you be looking for? So key factors within a net zero claim, the sorts of things that you should look at is what extent of the organisation does it cover? Does it cover the whole operation of the organisation, or is it only part of what the business does? So that clarity over that coverage becomes quite important. What activities are included? Is it just direct emissions? Is it including upstream and downstream? Does it include your supply chain's value chain as well? So that includes not just asking for your suppliers' Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but you want their Scopes 1, 2, and 3 as well. So that's where we start talking about value chain, because it's asking for your suppliers' whole emissions levels as well. So does that cover everything that an organisation has and what its suppliers do? What's the base year and what's happened since then? So if we start talking about reductions, when was that base year, and also what is the target year? When are you looking to achieve your overall goal? And then what practical actions are being taken? Is it a case of we're going to buy renewable electricity and we're also going to get electric vehicles, and that's our only activities, and after that everything else is secondary? So what kind of activities are taking place to be able to achieve? And finally, if offsets are being used and an organisation is talking about being carbon neutral, what's the due diligence taking place to make sure that these are reliable? So there are an awful lot of offsets available. There's a lot of very cheap offsets that are available, and those have very little credibility within the market. You still get a certificate for it, but the validity of those certificates are limited. So it's about understanding and providing the checks and balances over the offsets that are being used. And then finally, it's also about the quality of data that's being used for reporting. So how accurate is the information, and also what kinds of estimations are being captured. Again, from a data set perspective, the reporting requirements state about having an over-consumption and an over-reporting, because that ensures that you're always going to be lower than the number and the figures that you're reporting within your data set. So having that extra boundary, if you are estimating, having the extra boundary that says we're going to go slightly higher, that means that you're always on the safe side of what your actual reporting is. So the key here is that customers and consumers are asking questions about this, and we're improving our understanding of the question sets. We're improving our understandings of what it means to be transparent about what a net zero claim is. So it's about being careful of the language that is being used. And talking about why Scope 3 really does matter. So for a typical organisation, over 80% of emissions is Scope 3. From the FM data sets that we're running, there's a bit of variance in there depending upon how an organisation operates, but typically we're finding data sets of around 82% to 96% in terms of Scope 3 emissions. And that's also the reason why we say that your suppliers' emissions also needs to be scopes 1, 2, and 3. So a very quick check is that if you're looking at your organisation, you're finding your scope 3 as being low, then you probably haven't captured all of your scope 3 emissions fully and correctly, and the same will apply to your supply chain. If your suppliers are giving you data and their own scope 3 emissions is low, the likelihood is that they haven't given you the full breadth and depth of what their scope 3 data set is. So that allows for a conversation around how do we improve. So this data set becomes really important because it's where the forward trajectory is moving. So net zero, we've spoken about, science-based targets, it's also included, but it's also being covered in the new regulatory requirements and disclosures. So things like the TCFD, things like the new carbon reporting, which is going to be coming out next year, requires reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3. So we will see things like carbon reduction plans extending to cover wider areas of scope 3 emissions as well. So this is certainly that trajectory that's taken place. So how do we achieve it, and what do we do? So the initial starting point is an initial screening exercise of what's important to me, of the various categories in scope 3, what's important and what's less important. From that, you go through a modelling and baselining exercise. Start to collect data, start to collect information, but also perform some estimations. At that point, you're then getting towards a level where you're able to understand what your baseline is, where your estimations have been, and you need some further improvements in data quality, but you've got a good understanding of what your forward targets are going to be and the expectations of that. And then finally, your last stage is about that roadmap. So whilst you have a longer term plan, you need some interim targets that are there, and certainly your first interim target, a detailed decarbonisation plan in terms of how you're actually going to achieve that first stepping stone of that reduction. So that's in line with the likes of the science-based targets guidance and also the protocols which are out there. And you've got this 4-stage stepping stone to be able to get towards that decarbonisation plan. So it's not enough to just talk about having a long-term target. It's not enough just to start to capture some data. What we are looking at is that roadmap, because that means that there's action happening. And the mechanisms around it, I won't go into a huge amount of detail around this slide, but a lot of it is how do we move the way that we capture our emissions, which is activity data multiplied by emissions factor, which will give us what we want. And to begin with, we'll have a significant amount of estimation that will be based upon the activity data, and we want to move more towards reported data. And same way, emissions factors will use an awful lot, which is based upon spend or average sets. And instead, we want to move more towards physical and supply data sets. So the bottom is the far more accurate data set that's being produced. And out of that, we've got that ability of being able to improve and get towards that goals. So in terms of what that looks like for a emissions profiling, this is where we start to look at simplicity, which is at the bottom. It's easy to get industry benchmarks, those are publicly available, but reality is we want to get more specific data and to have that more product-based. So the work that we're doing, the Scope 3 research that we're doing is looking at getting that product-based emissions data sets, the business unit specific data sets. So that gives us more information for the FM sector and ability of being able to provide reporting. Certainly, it's the direction of travel for the future reporting is about having that improved data set. So we're removing on the non-reported and the industry benchmarks, and more we're looking at supply specific, business unit specific and products. To do that, your customers will be asking FM providers. FM providers will then be looking at their own supply chains for that data set. And this takes a while to be able to get accurate information, and everyone's in exactly the same boat here. So we're all at the same point learning about how we're going to capture the data and to be able to provide that through. So this is about the engagement that takes place with the supply chain in order to get to the endpoints that we need to get to. So standard emissions inventory that I've shown here, this is typically what it would look like. So your purchased goods and services amounts to somewhere in the region of 71% of your Scope 3 emissions. That's again typical of what we start to see. And your Scope 3 emissions in this scenario is about 86%. So this gives you a typical profiling of what we're looking at in terms of an organisation's emissions. So if an organisation only looks at Scope 1 and 2, they're only reducing their emissions by a small fraction of their total impact. And in terms of what this looks like for the FM sector, so this gives you a profile in terms of the 15 categories of Scope 3 and where to focus attention. So as mentioned, service sector, so a lot of it is the upstream. So it's really to focus upon the first 8 areas of the activities and the greenhouse gas protocol. So that's where organisations should, an FM sector should be providing some numbers and data around those first 8 areas. And as a quick example, in terms of what this then means of how you use this data, this is an example for a catering contract. So within a restrictive contract, then you have a lot of the requirements which are dictated. So the canteen, the cost of food, restaurant facilities, etc. So there's relatively small and limited ability for FM to be able to influence what goes on. But where you have a more flexible contract, then FM does have a huge ability to start talking about nutrition about the carbon footprints of the foods, about packaging, etc., to be able to significantly reduce the carbon footprint. So the way that we then talk about how those services are provided can start to influence our relationships with customers as well. Okay, so that's an introduction to Scope 3 and a lot of detail around what we mean by Scope 3, the role of FM. I'll hand over to Reid now to talk about actually how to do it all. Reid.
Great, Sunil, thank you very much for that. And I'll not apologise too much yet anyway. There might be a little bit of repetition in some of the stuff you hear, and I want everyone to see that as a very positive thing rather than anything negative. But if there is repetition, I'll skip over that reasonably quickly, just in, to keep some time for the questions and answers at the end. So hi everyone, my name is, if I go back one just for a moment, it's Reid Cunningham. I've been with BAM 25 years, and BAM's well known as a construction and civils group of companies. We have a parent in the Netherlands and two operating divisions, one in the Netherlands, one in the UK and Ireland. And BAM FM, which I work for, is operating in the UK. As I say, I've been there 25 years. I'm responsible for the sustainability strategy that's implemented by BAM FM in the UK. I'm also a member of the IWFM Sustainability Special Interest Group with Sunil, and I've been sort of managing the BAM FM's contribution and BAM FM's participation in the SFMI audits, which we're a partner with SFMI. And we've been doing that since about 2016. So just a little bit of background about me and BAM FM. And if we jump onto the next slide now, Sunil, that'd be great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit again just about the kind of big corporate picture about Royal BAM and its priorities. I'll cascade down into BAM in the UK and Ireland, and then into how BAM FM is contributing into that. So first of all, Royal BAM and the whole group place the highest possible priority on sustainability and the climate. As some evidence of that, BAM has been awarded an A listing with CDP. CDP is the Climate Disclosures Project, which measures environmental performance and disclosures by companies and organizations. And to get an A score with CDP, organizations must show environmental leadership, disclosing action on climate change, deforestation and water security. And they must demonstrate best practice in strategy and action. And companies on the A list will have undertaken actions such as signing up and setting science-based targets, which is something Sunil had mentioned there, and creating climate adaptation plans. I'll come back to CDP in a moment again, but we also have made a commitment to report through task force climate-related financial disclosures. So these TCFDs are formed from a global organization which was set up to help financial institutions better inform investors, stakeholders, and the public of organizations' sort of financial risks related to the climate. The disclosures by Royal BAM Board and other companies disclose climate-related financial risks, and this enables a more informed investment, credit, and insurance underwriting decisions to be made for the company, and also to facilitate the transition to more sustainable low-carbon economies. The risks tend to be divided into two types: is the physical risk of climate changing or affecting a business and its operations. And probably the more relevant one is the transitional risk, which is how the low carbon economy of the future will affect the business and whether the business is actually keeping up with those changes in the future. So we've made that commitment in the past. And as Sunil was also mentioning, TCFD is becoming adopted by financial reporting in countries around the world, including Europe and the UK. So these are becoming mandatory now for corporations of certain sizes. In 2023, Royal BAM launched a new sustainability strategy. We call that strategy Building a Sustainable Tomorrow. And the strategy comprises 6 elements, including decarbonisation, circularity, climate adaptation, plus also biodiversity, safety, health and inclusion, and social value. And the Scope 3 piece is particularly focused, what we're talking about today, on the first 2 of those, decarbonisation and circularity. Each one of those also linked to a sustainable development goal from the UN, decarbonisation being SDG 7 and circularity SDG 12. And it's interesting, I think, that so much is changing and adapting. You know, it's almost like the sand is moving under our feet. And although those sustainability development goals and our strategy have 2 segments there, which on the face of it aren't directly linked, for the reasons, and I'll come back to these as well, that Sunil mentioned earlier, I think from a whole life point of view and from an FM point of view, circularity is very much linked to decarbonisation and Scope 3. Now that's not terribly obvious, but I think it's becoming more obvious and more recognised, both in BAM, but elsewhere as well. And it's a very interesting point, I think, for us to watch. So, sort of cascading down a little bit then into BAM UK and Ireland, the text on the page here relates to announcements that were made by UK and Ireland in 2023. And many of these are seen as sort of leading the charge for a construction-based group on decarbonisation. And as you can see in the one of the paragraphs there, Scope 3 emissions, for which we've selected some boundaries for now, a little bit, again, like Sunil is saying, we need to understand what the boundaries are to start with. And those parameters can then be extended in the future, but you need to start somewhere. So we're starting with water consumption, staff transport across road, rail and air. And some of you might be thinking that sounds awful like Scope 1, but this is in relation to road, rail and air, where those are services delivered by a transportation company like Network Rail or an airline. So they fall into Scope 3, just to clarify that Scope 1, Scope 3 difference between business travel. But also emissions arising from hotels, which are being collected by tools and systems we use, and emissions from third-party fuel and energy use, including the well to tank upstream emissions. From the graph on the right, you can see that in terms of Scope 1 and 2, enormous inroads have been made. You know, when you start paying attention to this stuff and you start measuring and prioritizing action, then enormous benefits can be made. And our new sustainability strategy identifies some targets. So first of all, we intend to remain an A-listed CDP company at the Royal BAM level. In 2023, we intend for our emissions from Scope 1 and 2 to have fallen to 50% of the 2015 base. And by 2026, indicated on this graph, about 80% reduction in Scope 1 and 2 emissions. What's relevant for today is BAM have also committed to Scope 3 CO2 emission reductions. We call these indirect CO2 emissions. And the target for 2023, which is extremely relevant to our conversation today, is to understand better what it is and improve our measurement. There's no numerical target. However, by 2030, we intend to have a 50% absolute reduction in those emissions against the 2019 base, which is the only base we really believe we can get hold of. So the company is starting to understand this challenge, and as Sunil says, really get hold of it, because the opportunity for real carbon savings lies in tackling scope 3. I'll jump on just now if I can, Sunil, thank you. I'm trying to remember which slide's next. Right, okay, so this one I'll pass over very quickly. This is really just reinforcing a bit of what Sunil was talking about the definition of what net zero is. So according to science-based targets, don't let anyone fool you, scope 3 is quite clear in the definition. There's a lot, I think, of early adopters of the net zero strapline thinking and probably focusing on scope 1 and 2. Which are comparably extremely easy to measure. And as we've seen, the tip of the iceberg, quite literally. Scope 3 is included in the definition, and we really need to be aware of that as either companies who are signing up ourselves or companies, FM service providers supporting customers who have signed up to a net zero target, because they'll be coming back and asking us for some help with this. And if we jump on, again, Sunil, thank you very much. Again, one you've already seen, a slightly different illustration of the 15 elements that make up the scope 3 indirect carbon emissions. And this one taken straight from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Maybe one of the things that wasn't entirely clear, and if it was mentioned, I'll say it again because I think it's important, but when BAM and Aclaro, Sunil's team, set out to prepare guidance for the FM industry, it was really important for us to not create something new, but to create guidance which tracked something that was already recognized. And this GHG protocol is absolutely the standard of carbon definition, measurement, reporting understood throughout the world. So when we're talking about guidance for FM, this standard remains the base starting point. And what we're trying to do is for these 15 elements is make them relevant and make them consistently used by FM practice. So yeah, that's that one. And as I say, tip of the iceberg, you've already seen this one. My numbers, quite large parameters there. I'm really glad that Sunil was able to sort of back up my numbers a bit. These are, changing all the time as people understand scope 3 more. The most important thing is just to understand the scale of scope 3, the opportunity in scope 3 to actually make a difference. We recognize that scope 3 emissions will far outweigh scope 1 and 2, even though we haven't necessarily measured them all yet. And by tackling scope 3 emissions, it's a key part of BAM's decarbonisation strategy, from Royal BAM right throughout the group down to BAM FM. Scope 3 emissions are a consequence of the upstream and downstream operations outside of the company. So measuring and reducing these emissions is challenging because we've got limited or variable and sometimes virtually no direct control over these emissions. The complexity remains very high because of the large number of suppliers and products and partners that we have in our value chain. So BAM's target is to aim to first generate detailed insight into where the most significant emissions come from and then how we can measure those. Inevitably, we'll end up collaborating with partners and the supply chain to reduce these emissions in the most effective ways we can. And if we jump on, I'll come back to the circularity one later, put that one aside. So this piece about kind of relevance, about priority, the mechanism we've used to do that is kind of illustrated here with the 15 different elements. And Sunil had already showed you where some elements have been identified as kind of high priority and relevant. And this is an example here of how we actually came to do that in our trial project using the guidance that we're developing. So specific for a relevant project, this is actually a real live contract that BAM FM operate. We've reviewed the materiality of all these services on what we do, on all these categories on what we do. So the materiality is reflecting the size of the element to what we do. And what was very relevant for us, relevant's the wrong word, isn't it? What was very important for us next was to understand, as Sunil was saying, about the ownership. That example about the catering was an example. Do we really own this service? Or has the customer told us exactly what they want? So we don't really own it, they own it. But we might be either responsible for delivering it, or we might not be wholly responsible, but we can influence how it's delivered. So we started measuring for a contract the degree of ownership we had for different activities, the responsibility we might have for different categories of activity, or the influence that we felt we had for different activities. And in this way, we were able to prioritize, if you like, the relevance and make those relevant services our priority target, because that's where we think we can make a difference. They're material and we can do something about it. So this table here illustrates an output from one of the processes that we're working on in the guidance pack. And there's a simple formula behind the sheet that identifies the relevance. And if we jump on again, the next one was then not so much a sheet you can use, but just an extract to make the slide look a bit more interesting. This is an extract. What I found. Oh, an extract from the sheet where we used a series of worksheets for individual services to then dig down where our emissions were in that relevant category to then calculate actual emissions using a combination of data that we actually have, or kind of emission factors where that was the best we could get hold of. And the outcome of that is still being processed. So I'd love to tell you today there was an answer, but that's still something that we're working on. It's still live work that's going to be reviewed by the partners and SFMI and Sunil's team in the next few weeks. And we'll review that and publish later in the year the outcomes. What I was keen to do today was give some early feedback just about the sort of challenges we're already seeing. So within a big corporate entity like BAM, and I'm sure many people listening today, the FM department, BAM FM in BAM certainly have some slightly different operating tools than other parts of the group. So data from HR departments, finance departments, procurement departments, and FM doesn't necessarily link directly, and it might not even have common data or naming protocols. So sometimes the data is a bit glitchy. It might be hard to get hold of, and it's certainly sometimes hard to connect some of that data. Also, units of measurement. There are certain units of measurement anticipated, whether that's cubic meters of waste or kilograms of waste. Those are vastly different things. And if we're collecting the wrong data to start with, then that's certainly not helpful. So we need to align our units of measurement into something useful that can be standardized as far as possible. Yes, back to the product codes. We're finding it quite difficult sometimes to connect product codes between contracts. Some data isn't even digital. There's a lot of data in the FM industry held on sites all sorts of checklists, refrigeration schedules, refrigeration gas schedules, for example, all sorts of things. So getting hold of data isn't always quite as easy as we might have hoped. And it's certainly an area that's constantly improving, but something we have noticed. I think probably some clarity between some Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from Scope 3 are not always as easy as we thought they were. A couple of examples have arisen where we are using one contract as a hub to deliver services to another contract. And in certain cases, that does muddy the water a little bit. And I think we probably need to figure out how to overcome that, because I don't think it's an unusual circumstance for the FM industry. The supply chain support, there's a few enlightened supply chain partners out there who are, incredible. They are keeping up. Sometimes, they're even leading us in certain ways. However, the FM industry is largely made up of SME supply chain partners, quite geographically, small companies locally based who are delivering services. And in many cases, I think they are lagging behind a little bit and will need a lot of support and education to understand how they can contribute into the activity. The EPDs here are environmental product declarations. That still tends to be something that's slightly more rare than we might like. But ultimately that will become more important. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because it's also relevant to the circular economy piece. And another example about data that simply doesn't exist, it just is gone, it's invisible. It is data, for example, about commuting by employees. Many of our employees who don't receive any company support to commute to work, we simply don't know how they get to work, where they're coming from. And GDPR scares everybody a little bit into asking the question. So if we jump onto the next slide, how are we doing for time? Right, I'll speed up a little bit. So circular economy piece here, one of the early actions that we can crack on with is thinking about how we are operating in customers' built environment. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with the benefits of circular economy, or even recycling. It's a way not only of protecting resources, which has always been the primary focus, but in fact, it's also a way of drastically reducing embodied carbon, which is a Scope 3. If we jump on one, please, Sunil, thank you. An example of a project we recently had is where we intended to reduce a Scope 2 emission by changing old fluorescent tubes into shiny new LED lighting units. There was about 4,000 of these at a large police headquarters that we operate, and we really had responsibility. So we dived in with both feet. We thought we can do something about this. And it was a reasonably straightforward process to reduce Scope 2 carbon emissions using LED lighting. However, what we also thought we could do is reuse large amounts of luminaire bodies, with a large volume of aluminium and plastic, which could actually be reused, and we're putting the LED lighting into the old luminaire body. Plus, we also used containers at the bottom right there to deliver, to take away the old fittings back to the factory to be refitted, and then bring those refitted units back to the site to be fitted. And we saved over 2,000 kilograms of aluminium by doing that. If we jump onto the next slide, what was interesting about the product was it was originally produced, manufactured by a company called Whitecroft in Manchester. Whitecroft were very interested to support us in upgrading those units with the LED engine. And as a result of that, two things happened. Version 1 was what I've described, where we returned the units to factory and then brought them back to site. Version 2 was working with Whitecroft. We created a way of doing that piece of work on site. So we overcame the travel or transportation issue, which was a benefit, both economically and in terms of carbon. And version 3 was that Whitecroft came up with a whole new product line. And this is an environmental product declaration, and just an extract from it for illustrative purposes, of a new product which is cradle to cradle independently certified for a product with massively improved carbon intensity and embodied carbon. And we've already started using that product to reduce embodied carbon in either new premises that BAM Construction are building, but also in existing premises that BAM FM are operating. So this is a real example about where we can make a difference in circularity, but making a difference in scope 3 for our customers as well. And I think the last slide from me is just challenging that invisible data, or the data that simply doesn't exist. We've come across a company called Mobility Ways, who, as an independent, separate business, can make contact with our staff who commute to work and start creating work which doesn't touch our sort of GDPR concerns, because it's managed by the third party, but they can start to create personalized travel plans, car sharing plans, and all sorts of benefits to to our staff. And in doing so, also collect data about their commuting and how we can improve emissions that result from staff commuting to and from their place of work. Quite early days with that piece of work, but an interesting development that has presented itself to us. So I think that's me, and just in time for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Reid, for that. And as you can tell, both Reid and I are quite passionate about this, hence we spoke for a little bit longer than expected. We've got time for a few questions, though. There's a few that have come through, but if there's anyone else with some questions, please do add them into the Q&A function. So one of the questions that we've got is around the use of spend-based data for calculating Scope 3 emissions. Where did you get the data sets that you're using for your purchased goods and services calculations?
So a lot of it's coming from so we collect a lot of data, for example, on systems like pieces about that business travel with the hotels and all this stuff. We've got a corporate system that we're using. I'll say its name, but like the BBC, there's other products out there. It's a product called Agencia. So every time anyone in the company books rail, hotel, airplane travel, that is being collected, and then emission factors are being applied to hotel stays, things like that. For many of the other spends, financial data up for different product categories is being applied. And as I say, some of those product categories that we've used in the past maybe don't map beautifully or necessarily map beautifully into emission factors. But emission factors themselves are very useful, but we need to really understand where they're coming from to be able to make improvements, and actually pick them apart a bit. It's quite complex.
And I think that's certainly one of the findings that we've got from the Scope 3 research is the nuances that goes into the development of those. And we're finding that there's a few things which can actually have quite significant variance in what those emissions factors are. So if you understand those elements, you can get a much better and more realistic emissions factor for your operations. And vice versa, it also gives you an idea as to the key things to look for to be able to reduce your own emissions as well. So they're helpful in both of those ways as well. In terms of FM organisations which are just starting out on Scope 3, what recommendations, what advice would you give to them in terms of the first steps which they can take?
Well, I would say an awareness is a good start, and then wait for the guidance to be published in the autumn. Because I think it genuinely will provide a kind of a standard or a methodology which you can get behind. You know, in the meantime, it's maybe worth starting to talk to customers and suppliers about what their understanding of the Scope 3 emissions are, I guess, and starting to have a look at the data that you do have, just to see where it is and how readily available it might be.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Got a question also from Peter O'Sullivan, asking about the consistency of data and reporting of that, and a tool that can be used within the membership. So there will be one, it's the research project that we're currently developing. So there will be a framework document. It's going out for consultation next month. That's the work that we've been doing, which is building on from the GHG protocol. So we've got a consultation phase, but then it will go out as a framework document which will provide a standardized approach for measurement of FM emissions globally for the FM sector. And that will be launched through IWFM, RICS and IEMA as well. So that will come out in October. And then phase 3 of this project is about collecting lots of data based upon that. So there will be a software tool that will be developed to help us to collect a lot of the data. So if you want to be involved in that project, do get in touch. And for that, it's about collection of data and then the validation of emissions, so we can start to develop those emissions factors based upon the specific FM services. So it's the next part of the work that we're doing. We're just running out of time at the minute, so I'm going to just close on the last few slides that we do have. I've mentioned about this being a series of webinars which are taking place. So the final webinar in the group of 3 is taking place on the 12th of July, so please do book on that one. I think that will be from 12 till 1. You can join us early if you wish. That will be with myself, but it's also with Sharon Maynard from Skanska and also Chloe Fiddy from IEMA. And here we're going to be talking about developing the flight path for GHG. So that's about having your full target that's set out, but also then what does that look like in terms of how you're going to achieve it and the process and mechanisms to be able to do that. So in a similar way that Reid has mentioned for the way that BAM are operating in terms of a focus upon Scope 1 and 2 first, and Scope 3 activities being broken down into key chunks forms part of their flight path. At this point, I'm hoping also that we'll have some of the data specific that Reid was also referencing and mentioning as well. For ourselves, if you want to read more information about the Scope 3 project, please do go to our website. The 2 links are directly there, either for an email or to find some further details about the project itself. That's also the means that you'll be able to access the consultation when it goes live in around about 3 weeks' time. And please do have a look at that and to provide some feedback as well. For me, thank you very much for attending this webinar. Thank you very much to Reid for your useful and hugely helpful insights as well. Thank you very much to IWFM for hosting us as well. Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.